Welcome to today's live session with Emilia Terracciano and Sita Reddy. This discussion is a part of the series of public lectures and discussions organized by Science Gallery Bengaluru for its first fully online exhibition, Phytopia. For Phytopia, we hope to bring together engineers, scientists, designers, artists, and biohackers to create an experience where visitors can explore and experiment beyond the kitchen, the lab, and the farm. This program is organized in collaboration with Bangalore International Center. A warm welcome to today's speakers, Sita Reddy and Emilia Terracciano. Emilia Terracciano is a writer and art historian who teaches modern art history at the University of Manchester. Emilia's research interests lie in art, science, and ecology with a focus on the global south. She's currently working on a new project about art, agronomy, and science in art. Emilia is an active critic and essayist, writing regular book and exhibition reviews for Phrase, The Caravan magazine, and Marge. Her first book, Art and Emergency, Modernism in 20th Century India, was published in 2018. Sita Reddy is a sociologist and museum curator based in Hyderabad, who writes on a range of topics at the intersection of art and science, ranging from the history of natural medicine to the decolonization of museums and archival justice. Most recently, she guest edited Marge's magazine first ever special issue on botanical art, The Weight of a Petal, Ars Botanica. She has been a fellow at the Smithsonian Institute and Wellcome Library and visiting professor at the University of Hyderabad, Department of Fine Arts. Her curatorial experiences include exhibitions on yoga, Ayurveda, forensic medicine, criminal photography, and contemporary art. She's currently working on a book on the Indian Medicinal Herbal Archive, provisionally titled The Jangala Books. Welcome, Sita and Emilia. Before we move on to the discussion, I would like to remind our audience that there's a feedback form in the chat box. So please use that if you enjoyed this conversation and let us know how you feel. And I would also like to remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A box. And after the preliminary conversation, we will be putting forth those questions to the speakers. So throughout our programs and exhibits, we have attempted to shed light on how plants can be studied in a diverse set of arenas, including in plant science, forestry and gardening, agriculture and the ethics of environmentalism, and in food practices and politics. When we began researching about how plants were studied in art history, we came across a brilliant piece entitled J.C. Bose and Plant Autographs written by Emilia Terracciano in an issue by Marge magazine entitled The Weight of a Petal. This issue about botanical art was edited by Sita Reddy, who is also an academic advisor to Phytopia. Sita, if you could tell us a little bit about how you came across Emilia's work and why you thought it was relevant to include in Marge's issue about botanical art, that would be great.
First of all, I wanted to say Emilia and I have not met before, so this is very exciting for us. But so thank you for having me on, and to kind of like let the audiences know after that brilliant talk and film, which was very artful just now, that premiered on YouTube, how important the work that Emilia does, the extraordinary work that she's put together on the Bose archive and Gaganendranath Tagore's commentary or depiction of those anxieties, how important it is in pushing the boundaries of botanical art. So I have to first give a shout out to, having established that we haven't met, I have to tell you our meeting story. I was introduced to Emilia's work through our mutual friend and wonderful artist, Simran Gill, whose artist pages were commissioned for the last thing that you see in the Marg volume. And to fully kind of contextualize how important, at that point, we hadn't really thought about anything to do with Bose. So to kind of give you a framework of how let's just say, extraordinary Emilia's art work was, Marg is and a magazine, art magazine, that's been in publication for 72 years, 73 years. And in its 73 years of running, it had never put together an issue on botanical arts. So I knew when I wanted to do, when they asked me to do it, I wanted to look at it in terms of what the archive of botanical art, company art, colonial art forgets or erases. So we ended up focusing on the unnamed Indian native artists who were the actual creators of this hybrid form of company art, which were commissioned by the East India Company botanists and surgeons. But another huge gap in this was, of course, anything to do with J.C. I mean, the gap, the lacuna that J.C. Bose represented in this field was extraordinary, because we have the Botanic Garden of Kolkata, which is named after J.C. Bose. We knew about his very prescient plant experiments on plant intelligence and trying to establish that plants were sentient, communicative beings, but we had no way of understanding it or pulling it in visually until Emilia came along. And Simran, I looked up the emails actually just now, and I think Simran is on right now. So this is really, she was the matchmaker, and it's the brilliance of her putting together two very different ways of looking at botanical illustration that made this happen. And let me explain what I mean by that. The uniqueness of Simran's email said, this is a really unusual way of looking at botanical illustration. She didn't say much, but she said, it seems that with what the plant art autographs of Bose describe, these are images that through audio and some nervous system workings. She was vague because she didn't know much about it then. But then she introduced us, Emilia sent us her work, and we were blown away. Not only by the beauty, I think, of the fresco graphs, but also by the Tagore paintings. And I remember we were working on a very tight schedule. We were already, I think the final drafts were due in July. And we met Emilia in June, I think. So I checked just now. And so I called Latika Gupta, our associate editor, who I think is also online now. And I said, we have to have this. And she agreed. And we made it happen in a very short time frame. Emilia sent us her essay in 2 weeks. And there it is. And I think the uniqueness of Emilia's the archive that she pulled together was on two registers, really. One was Bose's own plant autographs in visualizing the voice, the speaking subject that Emilia's film referred to. But it was also then Tagore's kind of depiction of those, the relation between him and the scientific establishment, the anxieties through his encounters with Cubist art and through satire and cartoons, that kind of pulled it all together in very interesting ways. So the genius, I think, of the Bose archive, or what Bose did, was to give voice to the speaking subject. But I think the genius of what Emilia did was to kind of pull it all together visually. No, really.
I'm blushing, Sita. I'm blushing. I can't help it. Had I known, I'll call you more often now to ask for some pepping up. No, thank you so much. I can't say how honored I was to be invited by Simran, who I admire immensely, and B, to be introduced to you, who are your work is just incredible. And I just wanted to show this beautiful issue, the MARG issue that Sita is referring to, which she guest curated for MARG. If you can get hold of it, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's very rare, I think. It's quite rare in India, but maybe if you're lucky, you'll get hold of a copy somewhere. But it's a fantastic compendium, an archive of beautiful illustrations and essays, all unique contributions to the botanical, and also Simran's visual essay is remarkable. It's a beautiful contribution as well. So if you can, I really strongly encourage you to get hold of it.
It's available, as Gayatri may announce, but our audiences may know, for the duration of Phytopia in the reading room. It's out of print, sadly. But I wanted to, just before I turn it over to you, and I want to know how you encountered this archive, how you first met the Bose images. But I want to underscore two words that you might hear through the course of our conversation. And all the 22 participants, contributors to MARC, including Simran, were really dealing with botanical art through what you refer to in your film as botanical morphology, the structure of it, right? The form. How do you draw them? How do you identify them? Because it was a colonial archive, it was in the service of empire. So it was through what other speakers in your program have talked about, through the lenses of beauty or utility, a very objectifying lens. And this is the only piece, including Simran's pages really spoke about the futility of documentation, and the fragility of documentation, ultimately, how they can't be contained within a page often. Even this form of this hybrid form of painting. Emilia's work, that is, like channeling Bose, was really about botanical physiology. And this was the only article in the entire volume that dealt with physiology, botanical physiology. And through it, I think, which I hope we'll come to over the course of this conversation, the unifying philosophy that he laid out between plants and humans. And throughout, I think it was the focus on botanical physiology and how to then record it and visualize it and respond to it scientifically, that I think philosophically moved the discourse toward that unity. It collapses the distinction between plants and humans, that the Anthropocene that your film actually referred to kind of, in so many ways constructs. So it's a very different philosophical premise to even begin from. And it has all kinds of political implications, which, but I want to ask you, Emilia, for people who may have seen the film, maybe just sort of describe in a minute or so the uniqueness of this archive to you, your aha moment, and also the materiality of what happened when I assume you encountered Bose through your work on Tagore. Gayatri referred to your book, Art and Emergency, and one of the three artists you refer to, you focus on is Gaganendranath Tagore. So I imagine you got to Bose via Tagore. So tell us though about where you first met these materials. I'm always interested in stories of archives. What happened, where did you see them, etc.
So thank you so much again, Sita, for the wealth of information you've just shared. Again, it's sort of a personal, that collapse of a personal professional archive happening in my life, and it happened during my PhD, because during my PhD I was working at the Victoria and Albert Museum with curator Divya Patel, who is a wonderful curator, and she sort of initiated me to the wonderful collections contained at the V&A, which sadly are yet to see the light of day, so they're all in storage, and very few people have encountered these beautiful, I wouldn't call them illustrations, but images by Gaganendranath Tagore. And Divya then subsequently introduced me to Partametta, and an archivist called Tapashrey, so both were Bengali, and immediately they started to share stories about the remarkable work of Gaganendranath Tagore. And also, you know, everyone's heard of Rabindranath, Abanindranath, but Tagore was an obscure man, a very elusive figure who left very few photographs of himself, although he did love being photographed. So even if you look online, you'll find him posing, wearing his Tibetan gowns. He again loved writing as well as creating art, and was very much a theatre set designer. So on a number of occasions, he helped out Rabindranath Tagore create sceneries at Jorasanko. Unlike Rabindranath Tagore, though, Gaganendranath hated traveling, so he never moved from Calcutta, and he also didn't really enjoy the company of you know, guests or international crowds. So he, again, very obscure, very elusive, and sort of formed his impressions of art from sort of what Partamettas refer to print capitalism, forms of print capitalism. So illustrations that would come through Jorasanko, and I imagine that is how he came to discover the art of Japanese art of ukiyo-e, so the prints, but also cubism. So the first time I met with Parta and Tapash at the Victoria and Albert Museum, they sort of opened up these archives, and that's where I found, and if I can share my screen, I'll show you.
Extraordinary. I mean, well, maybe can I just jump in, Emilia, and just
say,
for the sake of
I'll just say this is the one image that was conserved at the V&A, but go ahead, Sita.
For people who may not know, although they may, Gaganendranath Tagore was, of course, Rabindranath Tagore's nephew and Abanindranath's brother. But yes, but I mean, the quality and the humor in these cartoons are just extraordinary, I think.
So this was, can you see the image?
Yeah.
Can you see what I'm showing? This was the image that I found at the V&A. Let me see if I can expand it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was just struck by its sort of quirkiness, the colors, the composition, but also I had never come across anything like this. So I'd always, you know, I knew about plants being very much involved in colonial projects, very early on, earlier than 1915 for sure. But Gaganendranath had looked to the botanical world in a very different way. And at this point, I had never heard of J.C. Bose and his experiments. But I was struck by the sort of staging, again, which makes me think back to theatre, and also this kind of stop animation quality built into the image, which is a postcard which he had sent to Rup Krishna, who was at the Royal, enrolled at the Royal College of Art at the time. And at the back, I don't have a photograph of the back, but you can see, you know, the postage, the address, and a little message by Gaganendranath saying, "How do you like my botanical cartoon?" So he's asking for some feedback. Later, I discovered a different cartoon, which was in a separate archive and included in a pamphlet produced by Gaganendranath Tagore in 1919, so shortly after the Rowlatt Act, publication of the Rowlatt Act. So this is the cartoon that I found in the pamphlet called Reform Screams, and this is conserved at the British Library, and it is entitled Inanimate Nature Responding to the Professor's Musings, and it's entitled, there's a subtitle to it called Nature Screams. So again, I think unlike the other botanical cartoon, I think in this one he's also perhaps making fun of Bose and his own desire perhaps to control nature and what happens when nature can no longer be controlled. So perhaps, you know, the flip side of, again, the Anthropocene, what happens when you're trying to control the elements and then suddenly the elements act out of their own will. So you see, you know, the mimosa screaming or shouting perhaps, shame, the telegraph plant pictured below, agitating, the bamboo shoots shouting strike, strike, then you find Mr. Frog, and Bose completely oblivious to what is happening behind him. So there's also a poem.
I love this one is my favorite. But and so who's saying, the frog is saying Bande Matram?
Bande Mataram is the frog, yes. And I also, I don't know, like there's this chant, I don't know if it's a moon or if it's it looks like it could look like a turnip also. So I don't know. There are some strange beings. There's also something at the top wearing monocles in the hiding in the Himalayas.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is. So some strange beings, which I'm yet to identify. And then obviously the thunderbolt, which, and you know, Bose's third eye. So again, this take on a man who is trying to channel the energies of nature, including electricity, and trying to communicate with the non-living, what he terms the non-living. And I think this is interesting also to think beyond the example of Gaganendranath, and also looking to science fiction. And Jagadish Chandra Bose was a prolific sci-fi writer. And in that story, which we were chatting about earlier on, the Missing One, which is a story about controlling the behavior of a cyclone, which is about to hit and destroy Calcutta. A man pours this can of oil, is it coconut oil?
In a bottle, right?
In a bottle, and prevents the hurricane, the cyclone, from destroying the city. And again, this is a story about, you know, controlling nature. It's also a story about masculinity, a man who's lost his hair and is at pains to grow it as fast as possible with the help of this Swadeshi magic potion. But he saves the city of Calcutta from this impending disaster. So yeah, again, very, very unique, a very funny story. And he won a competition. So this was a story submitted for a competition run by I think it's called Kundali Oil, which was a Calcutta-based company. In 1875, if I'm not mistaken. So, sort of, yeah.
So he was sort of promoting a commercial product, and that's interesting. Given his stance against patents. I want to come back to that, but it's interesting how he had very strong ideological positions on what public knowledge was and what public art was, right? I mean, and he did, Bose had, if I'm not mistaken, he was quite a brilliant science fiction writer, and he seems to have written quite a few novels. One of them was, I thought the title was the Bengali, Obayokta, which is unexpressed. And so I want to get back to it in the conversation in light of what you were speaking about with Walter Benjamin, you know, the unseen that is kind of coiled in maybe a plant or plant life. This is just fascinating. And they were friends.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just relying on secondary literature, but from what I understand, Bose did have his moments and had a very tempestuous temperament, and also was a bit, he wrote so much. He wrote so many treatises, many of which were, were never published. And he constantly resubmitted and submitted manuscripts to the Linnean Society, and so that they could be read, they could be published, or even critiqued. But he was so determined and so passionate, and nothing would really obstruct his drive for recognition, which he sadly, I think, never really was able to enjoy during his lifetime. So it's only now that we return to his work and think about it in different ways. But even, I don't want to get into these other debates, but there's many. Certainly when I then later went to the second archive in Calcutta and was able to view material there, stories about, Bose's own patenting, non-patenting of radio waves, and Giulio Marconi, the Italian engineer, later stepping in and patenting this discovery, which, he felt as a complete and total affront, as well as a form of silencing. Again, he certainly felt that he wasn't sufficiently equipped and also visible in the world of science. But I think it's just incredible, even when you walk into the Bose Institute, to see all these instruments, because they're all still there, these clockwork instruments which required so much precision also in them, putting them together and making them work. They're really clockwork. They are so minute. And he had sort of, unlike other scientists perhaps working in London, had a different kind of access to technology and materials with which to produce this technology. So even also that, I think, is incredible, because he had no support whatsoever. It was out of his entire, own initiative. And also his imagination is just remarkable, I think. Yeah.
And actually, even the plant, the autographs, and including the crescograph was just one of the instruments that he had to record movement. Is that right? Or it was, these are, so the mute subject, and then of course visualizing and giving voice to the mute subject. These are, to me, extraordinarily beautiful. I like, the notebooks themselves are a visual treat. I'm wondering if, in the course of, looking at it chronologically, do you see the minute he started recording this material on the crescograph, was there a gap between then rendering in his, in what you read in the secondary literature and, not necessarily in the primary, in the visual archive? Was there a gap then in how to visualize this mute, how to let the plant speak, to truly speak? We were talking about this a little earlier before this talk, but one of the things that struck me, especially in both the Tagore paintings and in what Bose himself writes, is the mute subject as part of oppressed subject in colonial botany. So how much of this is a colonial question? And I mentioned to you, and I wanted to see where you could take this. There's also, I saw them as love letters. So there was this sort of affection that he has for the, almost this pleading, please speak to me, almost, a lovelorn naika or something. And there is that aspect of the motive, the affect that underlies some of this, the philosophy and the visual archive. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. And does this reflect the gendered Victorian science establishment and Bose as a genuine scientist, speaking to his subject? Or we had the program by Janaki Amal the other day, and she was talking about I mean, they were, Janavi and Vinita Damodaran were talking about the gendered nature of the establishment in this time, and how that could co-create or produce certain kinds of knowledge, you know, and certain kinds of relationship with the things that you were looking at or listening to, in this case, listening to, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I can't really speak to the gaps in sound or vision when we're talking about the creskograph, partly because myself, coming at it from the discipline of art history, I'm completely, and I'll admit to this, I know very little about the actual workings, physical workings of the creskograph. But what I understand is that they involved, so the glass plate would essentially magnify plant response up to 10,000 times. So these, we're thinking about a gigantic magnifying lens, a little bit like the one that Gaganendranath himself is using to show us, you know, the Bengali Bajralo, the Babu, what happens to him, but where we're offered a magnifying lens, because otherwise we would not be able to perceive or to see with our senses this sort of strange Martian-looking creature. So he's equipping us.
Does the Babu have a cigarette?
He is. He's smoking. He's smoking. So if you look at him, he's partly dressed in Western attire and partly wrapped in a saffron colored robe, but it's his pointy ears that look a bit suspicious. He's not quite he's not the enlightened academic fresher coming out of university on his 7th stage. In any case, so the creskograph is amplifying, is magnifying, and that is why I was quite keen and struck by these congruities in discourse happening at the same time in Germany. So these, you know, everyone's come across Karl Blossfeld's gorgeous illustration, depictions of plant life. And, you know, through the writings of Benjamin and also those of the surrealist Georges Bataille, there is this fascination for nature and for forms that are yet to be perceived. So this idea that goes back also to Goethe of the Urform, the Urplant, a plant that is a kind of a primordial being and a plant from which all the other future plants are kind of stored potentially. So this idea that technology in some ways can perhaps usher us into new worlds, unimagined worlds, which we can then, you know, artists, architects, engineer, can use to plot structures on paper, in space, even film, perhaps. So plants are really at the you know sort of how do you say underpin the construction of our world in very powerful ways. But it's through photography that we can access this world of plants. And Benjamin was, you know, talking about many things, including the optical unconscious, and also this idea that plants can open up, new worlds. So there's something revelatory about plants when photographed by Blossfeldt. And when I came across this illustrated journal, published in 1933, so it's, you know, kind of climate in Europe is is changing, but in Germany there's a real fascination for India and all things Indian, including Bose, and his reception in Germany is phenomenal. They all want to meet with him, they all want to know how the creskograph operates, and they also talk of Bose as someone who communicates with plants, an enlightened India. Whose own understanding of science, in their view, was primordial, pretty basic. So I suspect they had no clue themselves that, you know, how complex the creskograph machine was. So they just thought this Indian could sort of point to a path back to simple life in nature, and kind of celebrate that unity through technology, which again is another sort of subtext, other part of my sprawling essay that I'm really interested in. But it's bringing together these very different kinds of illustrations and what they do with plants, and how plants really galvanize the imagination of both scientists and artists at the same time. I forget the second part to your question, Sita, about remind me. I've lost track.
What did I ask, Gayatri? Never mind. But what you said about Germany makes me think of the German forester you mentioned in your book. So moving forward, not just artists and scholars and architects and ways to think about visual culture, but advocates for nature, right? Today, Wohlleben and the Hidden Life of Trees has in some ways become the voice of ways to think about nature as animate to a large number of people across the world, I would say. And again, we were talking about this the other day, but the epilogue of Wohleben's book is, in the edition that I have, is written by Susan Simard, who of course is the scientist who has in UBC, the ecological professor of ecology, who has through fairly credible science established the mycorrhizal networks and the fact that trees can speak to each other and all of that. And in the Richard Powers book, The Overstory, which it's a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, supposedly from the tree's point of view, I think it works and doesn't work as a narrative form, but it's a very ambitious exercise. And one of the characters, I forget her name, Patricia Westerford or something, is modeled on Susan Simard. So what are we to make of the fact that in some way this philosophy of we are this almost anthropomorphic projection on plants, and then the collapsing of the distinction between plants and humans are what are carrying the social movements forward, or what the new environmentalism forward, because I think everybody in the Extinction Rebellion movements and Fridays for Future seems to know, and my own tree group in Hyderabad seem to know Wohleben's work and have now digested it. And sort of it's different from, there was the Secret Life of Plants that came along in 73 was discredited because of what was seen by the scientific establishment as not credible research. This, it seems its time may have come, but Bose was a writer, and a novelist and a science fiction novelist. Can we speculate what he might say or his legatees might say to the Fridays for Future people? What kind of novel could we have today? It doesn't have to be dystopian, is all I'm saying. And I want to connect it with another program that was on Phytopia the other day on archiving Eden and thinking about seed banks and photographs of seed banks, which is sort of it's an act of hope. It's both positive and negative because it's resting on this catastrophe, right, of what happens when we are at a point where we've destroyed the Earth's biodiversity. So is this sort of a parallel political impulse of saying, it's not an intervention. I was interested to learn that not many, in terms of interventions, nobody's quite sure at the seed banks when these seeds can be, or they've never been actually used in rewilding or reforesting or whatever. So
they have been used. The ones in Svalbard, the ones in Svalbard have been reused. As a brilliant film by a Palestinian artist called Jumana Manna called Wild Relatives. And they were used when Syria went to war, and there was a special request, an exceptional request made by growers who had lost their entire, all their collections of seeds, harvested, I don't know centuries, but families and families had harvested it, and they'd lost all their collections. So they made a special plea and a request to Svalbard to open up the seed vaults and recollect and duplicate the work. So there's a beautiful film made by Jumana about this process. And the retrieval of these seeds. And obviously what she's trying to get at is the existence of other communities, other growing communities who are producing seeds and conserving seeds that have not been duplicated and stored and archived in Svalbard. So she's thinking about alternative genealogies, alternative futures that can perhaps be stored in different ways, which don't require a kind of monopolization of the seed of life. So there's no, it's not about the control, but it's more about sharing, which is again perhaps slightly romanticized in itself, but this idea that farmers can collate and share knowledge, seed knowledge, rather than have a bank in Sweden where they are stored. So it's if you can, you should see it. It's a wonderful film. But going back to this question of Bose today, how would he address crowd of teenagers in India, in the UK? I think, I don't know. I think it's up to everyone can sort of imagine how to sort of envisage him. I think he would go back to cyclones and think about cyclones, maybe ice, maybe I don't know if he would use the analogy of trees, I don't know, but he'd certainly say, I told you so. If only you'd listened to me 17 years back.
I stand corrected on the usage, the reusage of the seeds, and I'd love to see the film. But I think where I was going with that was that act of preservation that on a global level is an act of hope, but the opposite, it's sort of resting on a precipice. And these, let's say, Wolleben, and there are a slew of writers who have been talking about Robert, the person who wrote the British nature writer who wrote The Understory. But anyway, there are, you know who I mean. They kind of seem to premise faith rather than hope. I mean, and I say this with tongue firmly in cheek. I'm not being all mystical about this. But I...
No, I see what you're saying. It's, it makes me think of, I won't go there, but it makes me think of, fever, anxiety, as well as hope. But this idea, I think why I mentioned the film, Jumana Manna's film, it's because she's thinking about, yes, all those seeds that we choose to save and preserve, but also all the seeds that we choose to erase in that act of, wanting to save and wanting to store. It's a bit like, Noah's Ark, which is an allegory which has been used in so many different mythologies, but this idea of selecting the seeds, and there's something quite creepy about it, I find. But surely, yes, of course, it's premised on an act on hope, and Yeah, I don't know. I have ambivalent feelings about these gigantic seed banks, but I don't know. You've worked with archives that make the invisible visible, right?
Well,
Mm.
actually, that brings me to one of the items in the reading room is the antenna um, uh, group of is the magazine put out by Giovanni Ale.
Hello,
I have
yeah.
that right. And he, when he was speaking to the Archiving Eden project, um, was talking about how he was struck between the visible invisible junction, how to make the visible invisible. And I think so his book was titled Why Look at Plants, of course referring to John Berger's book of Why Look at Animals. I mean, the title Why Look at Animals. Have we perhaps with Bose's work, with Bose as our guide, perhaps the time has come to think about why listen to plants.
Mm-hmm.
And the flip side of plant blindness, which is what you were referring to from the high Victorian establishment of scientific establishment of looking at plants which to our extractive, whether it was extractive industries of empire or today's extractive multinationals, can only be about beauty or utility or strangeness or exoticism or whatever. And maybe one can introduce a new register, plant deafness. Should we be listening to plants in some ways? Anyway, I think there are a number of questions, Gayatri. So
Yeah. So I didn't want to interject in that fascinating conversation, but we have a couple of questions from the audience. So I think a good sort of lead into what we were discussing before this about Giovanni Aloy's work. There is a question from Arnie who says, how do we think about a decolonial project while also using an anthropomorphic technique that might be considered a colonial impulse for decentering the human or giving voice to nature, plants, animals?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, how would you like to address that?
I suspect that opening is not available to us as humans. It's a utopian vista that we cannot enjoy, and I like what the question asks, which is also thinking about Bose's own sort of own drive, own perhaps will to power. This idea of, yes, on the one hand, wanting to speak like a gentleman to a plant that had been denied sensitivity, yet on the other hand, also wanting to galvanize it, to electrocute it, to get a response out of this inanimate thing. So it's, going back to Sita's point, is it a love letter? I think it's a tough relationship. It's a difficult relationship. There's a lot of love and potentially a lot of hate as well on both sides. I don't know, the poor Mimosa, what she might feel about being pulled and pushed apart. But there is certainly a colonial impetus, which is also what has driven the scientific impetus, right? Which is anthropomorphic par excellence. But I think why I ended with this idea of, can you hear her speak? I ended up gendering the plant again. So the plant is again womanized, feminized. But this idea which sort of opened up to me as a possibility was very much during the lockdown days. So this idea that it's possible, if you start listening, you start seeing. Sometimes you don't see at all, you only hear. You only hear a bird. I can't hear trees yet, but I'll work on it. It's about really achieving a kind of a tuning in with nature, maybe closer to what Rabindranath Tagore had in mind of a kind of letting go and an opening up and trying to perceive things in a very different way. I don't know if we can listen in any in any other way. So that's how I would respond to that question. Sita, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's well answered. I
Yeah.
mean, one can only speculate for now. But Gayatri, I think there are a whole bunch of
Yeah.
questions,
Yeah,
right?
so Hasiru B wants to know if there was a sort of miscritique of Donna Haraway somewhere in your lecture. You show her image when talking about the valorization of the animal in the non-human term, but they were hoping that you would probably. But
I didn't catch her name. Could you repeat her name?
Hasiru.
Asiru, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I'm always sort of reluctant to take on post-humanist, non-humanist writings, but at the same time, I do think that some of the most interesting work surrounding fungi, plants, has come out of feminist debates, particularly thinking about studies surrounding plant intelligence, like Galliano's, who is based in Australia. Yet with someone like Haraway, who has been so sensitive to this question of the mute in nature, she hasn't really picked up on plants at all. So she's, for example, thinking about her dog, her companion. In her most recent book, Troubles with the Clucrocene, she does talk a bit about anemones, I think. But perhaps the most radical of all has been Anna Singh with her book, with her latest book, where she's thinking about mushrooms. So, you know, the mushroom at the end of the world. So, but she's not really, you know, looking at or thinking through things like sentience or intelligence. She's thinking about global networks of capital and things like, you know, economies like the foraging economy and how it might fit not into that global system. So there's no real, you know, harsh critique of Haraway. It's just using her picture with, you know, Haraway posing with her dog, and again exchanging looks. So the main point I was trying to get at is that if a human doesn't exchange a glance with another non-human, then it's rare for that being to qualify as sentient. So plants have no eyes, so we won't relate to them in the same kind of way. So vision seems to be crucial here, but also the, you know, the exchange of looks, of glances.
And the primacy of the visual, right? His thesis.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Hasiru also wants to know if you could give us some more details about the date and the place where the Shantiniketan image that you shared that was a part of the lecture. And if you could also reflect a bit more on your description of the Tapovan as an ancient Indian ideal.
Oh dear. Okay, well, the forest, I was just thinking about the Tapovan as an ancient forest hermitage. So this is how Tagore Rabindranath himself talks about, you know, his radical pedagogical exercise of, you know, ushering children or the students into nature. And he refers to Shantiniketan as a forest, to the plains surrounding it. And he's also very aware of how his own project, how Shantiniketan itself has really quite changed the landscape. So how the setting up of a university has also interfered perhaps with the natural landscape. So he describes it as an experiment with the ancient idea of the Tapovan. So I would go back to him and that collection of writings called The Voice of the Forest, which is wonderful, where he does use this expression of achieving a tuning in with nature, which has obviously spiritual connotations, I suspect. And the image was, I'm going to have to look up, I'm not entirely sure as to the date. Sorry about that. I can get back to Gayatri if you like, and if I can unearth that caption. I don't think I have it. I'll check on the PowerPoint that I just pulled out, but I suspect it's undated. Yeah, no, it's not dated. But I can find out. It'll be, you know, early 20th century, 1921 maybe, I guess. Well, something like that.
So Arundhati Rai says there's a fantastic connect between listening and hearing and establishing the female gender. Why not the male gender?
Well, there is a telegraph plant, but he doesn't display the same kind of affection towards the telegraph plant, which I imagine in my own gendered way, I imagine as being male. But the Mimosa pudica, again, this goes back to earlier debates which had developed in literary and scientific circles in Victorian Britain. So I'm thinking I wanted to make that connection, which perhaps it's false, I don't know, but I was just struck by these continuities between Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, Percy Bysshe Shelley writing about the Mimosa, and both thinking about the question of sentience surrounding plants and slaves, which you know, were treated as things which were voiceless and had no access to the legal arena, essentially. So they were deprived of voice and treated as pure commodities. So I think there's a kind of strange equation there being made between the inanimate plants, the vegetal kingdom, and the slave, the human, that can, the non-human that can be trafficked across the Atlantic. So I think that's the connection I wanted to make, and the connection that I wanted to perhaps bring out was that in the writings, you know, with Sir Joseph Banks, Shelley, and even Erasmus Darwin, the mimosa always emerges as a pudic plant, a plant that on some occasions shrinks and covers her genitals, which is a ridiculous thing to, you know, to posture even imagine. But this is what they were thinking about, you know, how to see and think about plants as being female. There's no question of them being male at all. And Bose is tapping into that existing world and trying to approach the mimosa perhaps as a gentleman, as someone who wants to have a conversation with the mimosa, as well as electrocuting her later. But yeah, first comes the the courtship, the wanting to speak. And he doesn't really experiment with trees. Like he uses plants that are potted plants, or kind of domestic plants that you would have around, you know, at the house. So he's not thinking about oaks or larger trees at this particular point.
The interesting thing is that the third plant that's usually used to measure movement in plant intelligence studies is the Venus flytrap. So it's sort of like it throws a whole different thing into the
which Charles Darwin is drawn to the Venus.
And I think holds center stage in the Botanic Garden in Erasmus Darwin's staging. I think we have
yes. We have another question from Hira Nabi, who says, in granting agency to non-human beings, we anthropomorphize them, like plants experiencing shame, for instance. I wonder if in this way we are reducing them to categories only readable by humans. Should we somehow become more plant-like, animal-like, elemental? Stillness being a big part of observing other human beings and trying to understand them and of observing other beings and trying to understand them and experiencing them.
Yeah, I think this question is part really related to the previous one about the degree to which we as humans can comprehend other worlds, other non-human worlds. So I don't know. Maybe Sita, would you like to say something? Yeah, I mean, certainly in the case of both, I think that's what Gaganendranath is getting at in the inanimate scream, nature responding to the professor's musings. I think he, as I said before, he's sort of making light fun, gentle fun of Bose and his, desire to control nature, to make nature speak and say what he wants, and nature perhaps not responding in the way that he intends. And Gaganendranath visualizes that as a strike. So essentially what the plants are doing are striking against Bose, right? Their master. It's a bit like his master's voice, like they're turning against him now and they're not doing what he wants. So I think perhaps you could pick up and develop a kind of critique there with Gaganendranath and think about the flip side of that situation. So us colonial subjects, living under empire, this is what we are undergoing on a daily basis, but we're doing the same thing to plants, and certainly Bose is doing the same thing. So that writing, when I just saw those, his handwriting, strike, it made me it made me really excited, because I was thinking this is how Gaganendranath is trying to make these plants speak. And also that part where he talks about Saraswati and Lakshmi always poised and sitting on a lotus, and the lotus is just saying, I'm fed up with this, enough of you, go away, and doing their own thing. Also the lotus can do other things. So I think he's just trying to be playful, and how to do that with the still image, very difficult to achieve if you can't animate. Again, this question of animating the dead, the inert image, how do you do it if you can't use language? So yeah.
So we have tuning into this webinar Krishna Bose, who is the great grandniece of J.C. Bose. She's now based in Baltimore at the Johns Hopkins University, and she wanted to know whether there would be a link to the Marge issue, but I just want to tell everyone who's tuned in that we have displayed the weight of the petal Ars Botanica in our reading room, and you can find it there, and the exhibition is on until 30th. So that Marge issue, which Sita has edited and Emilia has contributed her piece to, would be available in the reading room. So thank you so much.
I'll just jump in and say, but the exhibit that Emilia's work refers to is a standalone exhibit, right?
Yeah.
So you might want
it is. Yeah, so I mean, there's also a standalone exhibit, as Sita just mentioned, about J.C. Bose, and it includes these photographs and paintings that Emilia has so beautifully shown in both this live discussion as well as in the lecture. And it includes an essay by Emilia Terracciano as well. So please check that out. And before we close, are there any sort of final things that you'd like to say, Sita and Emilia?
Emilia, last word to you.
Thank you all, and thank you so much, Sita and Gayatri, for this conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely. So thank you, and thank you to all the people. Thank you to all the people who asked enjoyable questions too. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for tuning in. As I said before, we have a feedback form that you can find in the chat. So if you enjoyed this conversation, if you think we can do things better, please fill out the feedback form. And Phytopia is on until the 30th. So please do check out the rest of the programs and the exhibits on our website. Thank you so much, and see you soon.